The derelict boatyard was a graveyard of ambition, its skeletal remains jutting from the marsh like the ribs of forgotten sea monsters. For Elias Thorne it was a mirror. To anyone else, this patch of forgotten coastline, the rotted piers, the rusted machine shop, the collapsing sheds, was less than worthless, a liability poisoning the earth. But his dog, Major, a German shepherd with eyes that held the wisdom of an old soul, knew better. The dog wasn't just loyal. He was a diviner, and he had led Elias here to the hull of a single, half-sunken trawler, obsessively pawing at its decaying planks as if trying to unearth a saint. Major knew that buried within this monument to failure was a $200 million secret, a truth so profound it could heal a shattered man, and so dangerous it had already cost one good soldier his life and could very well cost Elias his own. If you believe that the deepest wounds can be healed, and that the loyalty of an animal can guide a lost soul home, please support our channel by subscribing. We are deeply grateful for every member of our community, and we'd be honored to know, where are you listening from tonight? The silence in Elias Thorne's life was a physical presence, a heavy blanket woven from grief and guilt. It filled the corners of the small, drafty cabin he'd bought with the last of his military pay, a place where the only other heartbeat belonged to Major. Nights were the worst. That's when the memories came, not as gentle whispers but as violent, concussive blasts of sand, smoke, and the final, confused look in Leo's eyes. They had been more than brothers in arms. They were just brothers. The official report called it a textbook ambush in a forgotten corner of a forgotten war. Elias called it an execution. He'd been there, feet away, pinned down by a spray of impossible fire, and the one thing he could never reconcile was the sheer, surgical precision of it all. It wasn't a chaotic firefight. It was a targeted hit, and Leo was the target. The guilt of surviving was a cancer eating him from the inside out. He'd drink to numb it, to drown the voice that whispered he should have done more, should have seen it coming. One evening, as he reached for the bottle of cheap whiskey, a wet nose pressed firmly against his hand, pushing it away. Major whined, a low, guttural sound of disapproval, then nudged his head toward the door, his gaze fixed and unwavering. He repeated the motion, a silent but absolute command. "Stop this. Come with me." Elias looked from the dog's earnest face to the bottle, and for the first time in months, he chose the dog. He followed Major out into the dying light, across the overgrown yard, to the rotting trawler that listed in the mud, a forgotten queen in a court of ruin. The name, barely visible beneath decades of grime, read the serenity. It was a bitter joke. Yet Major stood before it, resolute, as if presenting Elias with his new mission. The first few days were an act of penance. Elias worked until his muscles screamed and his hands bled, tearing away rotten wood and hauling debris. It was mindless, punishing labor that quieted the storm in his head. Major never left his side, a silent foreman watching with intense focus. The work was therapeutic, each salvaged plank a small victory against the decay that had claimed both the boat and his spirit. He started with the captain's cabin, a space filled with soggy charts and the ghosts of old voyages. As he ripped up the floorboards, warped and soft with rot, Major began to dig frantically at one specific spot, his paws sending splinters flying. He whined, looking at Elias, then back at the floor, his insistence absolute. Elias grabbed a crowbar. With a groan of protesting wood, the boards gave way, revealing not mud and bilge water, but a small, hollow space. Nestled inside was a metal box, wrapped tightly in oilskin. It was heavy, solid. As Elias lifted it, he felt a strange current pass through him, the first flicker of something other than grief. Felt like purpose. Inside, protected from the damp, was a thick leather journal and a rolled-up chart, not of the local coastline, but of the stars. The journal belonged to a man named Silas Croft, the boat's original captain, and its pages were filled with a meticulous log of tides, weather, and cargo. But interspersed between the mundane entries were passages written in a complex cipher. Elias, whose mind was trained in signals intelligence and cryptography, felt a familiar switch flip on. He spent the next 3 nights by the light of a kerosene lamp, his military past serving a new, unexpected purpose. The code revealed a second story. Silas had discovered a sunken galleon offshore, a Spanish treasure ship lost for centuries. He was secretly salvaging it, but he feared his business partner, a man of immense wealth and no conscience. The last entry was a desperate scrawl. He knows. He will take it all. I have hidden the proof of my claim. The stars will remember what men forget. The star chart wasn't for navigation. It was a key. A deep sense of kinship settled over Elias. Silas was a man betrayed, his life's work stolen. Restoring the serenity was no longer just about keeping busy. It was about unearthing a stolen legacy. It was a mission. The weeks bled into a month, then two. The boatyard, once a tangle of weeds and rust, was now orderly. Piles of salvaged timber sat next to neatly organized tools. The Serenity herself was slowly being reborn. Elias had reframed her hull, painstakingly replacing each rotten plank with new oak. The rhythmic rasp of his plane and the solid thud of his mallet, a new kind of heartbeat for the quiet yard. With the physical restoration came a subtle internal shift. The tremor in his hands had steadied. He slept through the night without the aid of whiskey. The memories of Leo were still there, but they were less like shrapnel and more like a dull, heavy ache he could carry. The project forced him out of his self-imposed exile. He needed supplies he couldn't salvage. Marine epoxy, copper nails, specialized sealants. This meant trips to the nearby town of Port Blossom, a sleepy fishing village that time seemed to have forgotten. At the local hardware store, a woman named Sarah, with kind eyes and hands dusted with sawdust, recognized the look of a man trying to rebuild something. "You're the fellow who bought the old Croft place," she said, her voice warm. "No one's touched that yard in 50 years. Thought it was haunted." She told him stories about Silas Croft, a good man who vanished one day, leaving everything behind. People said his partner, a slick city man, had cheated him. The small talk was awkward for Elias, but it was also grounding. It was a thread of human connection in his silent world, a reminder that there was life beyond the boatyard's fence. But that connection was also a vulnerability. He was no longer invisible. He was the man fixing the ghost ship. His quiet mission now had an audience, however small. One afternoon, the crunch of tires on the gravel drive announced a visitor. A low-slung, impossibly black sedan rolled to a stop, and from it emerged a man in a tailored suit that cost more than Elias's entire property. He was handsome, with a practiced, easy smile and the predatory stillness of a shark. "Mr. Thorne," he said, extending a hand. "Alistair Finch. I represent a development group that has a keen interest in this coastline major." Standing beside Elias, let out a low growl that vibrated through the ground. Finch ignored the dog. He swept his arm across the vista of marsh and sea. "We're planning a series of luxury eco-resorts. This little plot of yours is the final piece of the puzzle." He made a generous offer, a figure that would have been life-changing for the man Elias was just a few months ago. But Elias looked at the half-restored hull of the Serenity, at the legacy of Silas Croft he had sworn to uncover, and felt an unshakable sense of duty. "It's not for sale," Elias said, his voice flat. Finch's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold for a fraction of a second. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Thorne. It's just a matter of finding the right price. Think about it. That boat," he gestured dismissively, "is a wreck. I'd be doing you a favor by hauling it away for scrap." He handed Elias a business card, slid back into his car, and was gone, leaving behind only the scent of expensive cologne and a palpable sense of menace. Elias knew, with the certainty of a soldier who has studied his enemy, that this was not a simple business transaction. It was the opening move in a new war. The response came 3 nights later. Elias was woken not by a sound, but by Major's rigid posture at the foot of his bed, a deep, silent growl rumbling in his chest. Elias grabbed the heavy iron fire poker and moved silently to the door. The air was cold, thick with the smell of salt and something else, aerosol paint. He swept the yard with a powerful flashlight. His supply shed was ransacked, tools scattered, bags of expensive sealant slashed open and ruined. And there, on the newly planked side of the Serenity, scrawled in jarring red letters, was a single word: sell. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a violation, a desecration of his work, of Silas's memory. The cold fury that washed over Elias was an old, familiar friend. This was Finch's work, a blunt instrument to intimidate and demoralize. But Finch had miscalculated. He thought he was dealing with a broken-down recluse. He had no idea he was provoking a man who had been forged in the crucible of war, a man whose dormant survival instincts were now wide awake and razor-sharp. The threat didn't scare him. It focused him. The boatyard was no longer a sanctuary for healing. It was a defensive position. His mission was no longer just about restoration. It was about holding the line. Finch had made it personal, and Elias would prepare for his next move not as a carpenter, but as the soldier he once was. The act of desecration hardened Elias's resolve. He worked with a new, feverish intensity, driven now by anger as much as purpose. He returned to Silas's journal and the star chart. The coded message had mentioned a final safeguard, a place where the ship's heart beats, shielded by steel, the engine room. It was a cramped, greasy space that he had mostly ignored, but now he examined every inch. Behind the massive, seized engine block, he found it. A steel plate, seamlessly welded to the hull, painted and grimed to be nearly invisible. It took him a full day with a cutting torch and a grinder to breach it, the shriek of metal on metal echoing his own frayed nerves. Inside the hidden compartment was another box, this one made of heavy steel and locked with a combination tumbler. Following the final set of coded instructions from the journal, which corresponded to celestial coordinates on the star chart, Elias carefully worked the dial. With a heavy clunk, the lock disengaged. He lifted the lid. The contents were not gold or jewels. They were documents, neatly bundled. Shipping manifests for high-end electronics, offshore bank statements showing transfers of millions of dollars, and a series of incorporation papers for a shell company. And beneath them, a small, tarnished object that made the air leave Elias's lungs in a single, ragged gasp. It was a dog tag. He didn't need to read the name. He knew its weight, its feel. L. Henderson. Leo. His Leo. The manifests were dated from their last tour. They detailed illegal arms shipments disguised as electronics, moving through a private logistics firm. And the signature authorizing every single transfer, the name on the Shell Corporation's charter, was Alistair Finch, formerly Captain Alistair Finch, their commanding officer. The world tilted on its axis. The ambush wasn't just a setup. It was a cleanup operation. Leo must have discovered what Finch was doing, and Finch had him silenced. The two separate traumas of Elias's life, the loss of his brother and the threat to his sanctuary, were not separate at all. They were one single, gaping wound, torn open by the same man. Finch hadn't just stumbled upon his boatyard. He had been hunting for what Silas Croft had hidden, the laundered money that had likely passed through his hands, and in doing so, he had stumbled upon the one man on Earth with a debt to collect. The rage that followed was Arctic cold. It was a pure, clarifying force that burned away all the grief and left only a diamond-hard point of certainty. Going to the authorities was not an option. A powerful man like Finch would bury him in legal maneuvers, discredit him as a disturbed vet, and make the evidence disappear. Justice would not be found in a courtroom. It would be found here in this yard on his terms. Elias Thorne, the restorer, was gone. In his place stood Sergeant Thorne, Special Forces. His mission was no longer restoration or even revenge. It was tactical justice. He spent the next 48 hours transforming the boatyard from a workshop into a kill zone, albeit a non-lethal one. His military training, once a source of his deepest trauma, now became his greatest weapon. He used his knowledge of the terrain, every ditch and pile of lumber, to create choke points and fields of fire. He rigged tripwires connected not to explosives, but to nets weighted with scrap metal and buckets of viscous marine grease. He set up a system of pulleys and ropes on the Serenity itself, turning the half-finished deck into a trap. He was an artist of defense, preparing his canvas. Major watched his every move, a silent, attentive partner who seemed to understand the shift in the air. The dog's calm presence was a steadying anchor in Elias's controlled storm. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man who had turned to face it, using the very skills that haunted him to protect his future and honor his friend. This wouldn't be an ambush. It would be a reckoning. They came after midnight, a black SUV gliding to a stop just outside the gate. 3 figures emerged, moving with the clumsy confidence of hired muscle. Finch was with them, directing them from the rear, a general sending his pawns forward. They cut the chain on the gate and moved in, flashlights slicing through the darkness. The first man hit a tripwire near the machine shop. A heavy cargo net, laden with old engine parts, dropped from the rafters, enveloping him in a clattering, inescapable cage. The second man, startled, rushed toward the sound and slipped on a patch of ground Elias had deliberately saturated with grease. He went down hard, his ankle twisting with an audible snap. Finch, furious, pulled a gun and moved forward more cautiously, heading for the one place he knew Elias would be, the boat. He stepped onto the gangplank of the Serenity. Elias was waiting for him on the deck, unarmed, standing in the moonlight. "Finch," Elias said, his voice calm and even. "You came for your money." Finch raised his pistol, the smug smile returning to his face. "I always get what's mine, Thorn. I found Croft's little treasure map years ago, but could never find the final key. You did the hard work for me, and just like with your buddy Leo, you were too stupid to see what was right in front of you. He was a loose end. So are you." As Finch centered the pistol on Elias's chest, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the captain's cabin. Elias gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It was the only command Major needed. With a guttural roar that was pure protective fury, the dog launched himself through the air. He didn't go for the throat. He went for the weapon. His jaws clamped down on Finch's wrist with crushing force. The gun fired, the shot going wild into the night sky, and then clattered to the deck. Finch screamed in pain and shock, trying to shake the 75 pounds of determined muscle from his arm. The momentary distraction was all Elias needed. He moved in, a blur of motion, disarming Finch with a swift, brutal efficiency that spoke of years of training. The fight was over before it had truly begun. With Finch and his disabled thugs securely tied with marine rope, Elias retrieved the steel box from the cabin. He used a burner phone to make one call, not to the local police, but to a number for a federal task force he remembered from his service, a unit that specialized in military corruption. He gave them the address, a brief description of the situation, and the details of the offshore accounts from Silas Croft's documents, explaining they would find evidence of arms trafficking and murder. He left the box on the pier in plain sight. He didn't wait for the sirens. He and Major simply faded back into the shadows of the boatyard. His justice was done. Over the next year, the name Alistair Finch appeared in the news, tied to a sprawling federal investigation. The fortune Silas Croft had discovered, and which Finch had laundered, was seized. Through quiet, anonymous legal channels, Elias directed the entirety of the recovered funds into a newly established entity, the Leo Henderson Legacy Foundation, dedicated to supporting the families of soldiers betrayed by the very system they swore to serve. The old Croft boatyard, now legally owned by the foundation, was transformed. It became a place of healing where veterans could come to work with their hands, restoring old boats and, in the process, themselves. The Serenity, now fully restored to her former glory, gleamed in the sun, her name no longer an irony but a promise. Elias was no longer a ghost. He was a quiet, steady presence, a guardian of a legacy born from tragedy. He had finally brought his brother home, creating a sanctuary where a quiet man and his loyal dog could finally find peace. In the end, the story of Elias and Major reminds us that the path to redemption is often paved with the very things we tried to leave behind. The scars of the past, when faced with courage, can become the tools we use to build a better future. It teaches us that true loyalty is a compass that never fails, a quiet, steady presence that can lead a soul out of the deepest darkness and back into the light. The greatest treasures are not gold or silver, but the unwavering bonds of love and duty that refuse to be broken, even by death itself. What was your favorite moment in Elias's journey of healing? We would be truly honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and reflections are the heartbeat of this community. If this story moved you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more content that celebrates hope and the strength of the human spirit.